You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Tara Moss on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book that's out finally in the States. It's called The War Widow, and we are super excited to bring this book to you today. This is a must-have going into the new year. You know, we're only a couple of days away from finally breaking through to 2021 and all the hopes and dreams that I think we all have stacked on a new year. It feels like New Year is it has more weight to it this year. Like there's a lot of hoping and praying about what 2021 will bring. And you need to have this book with you as you cross over into 2021. The War Widow. Thank you for joining me today, Tara.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Hank. And yes, bring on 2021, I say. We're just about there. Been hanging on, tooth and nail.
I know. Well, Tara, we begin each show with the same question. And before we can get into all the great conversation I know we're going to have, we have to broach this question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's a great question. For me, it's a pretty vivid memory. It was actually Stephen King who made me want to write. I was 10 years old. I know this because I had loose leaf binders where I would write Stephen King style novelettes for my classmates in high school and elementary school. Actually, it would have been elementary school back then. And I was at Torquay Elementary, 10 years old, and writing Stephen King style little novelettes, and they were choose your own adventure style. So my friends would pick what would happen next, you know, if the demon car would come after them, or if the, you know, creature in the closet would come out, or whatever it was, come out from under the bed or from the crypt. And that was my very first, very vivid memory of wanting to be a storyteller. And Stephen King, for me at that time, you know, it was the 80s, and there were a lot of his most sort of classic books coming out at that time, and movies coming out as well. So there was a lot of presence there to do with his work. And because I was 10, I wasn't allowed to read it. So that just made it all the more appealing. So I found ways. And that's the beginning for me. It was a mixture of excitement and taboo of reading something I wasn't supposed to be reading yet, and scaring my friends and kind of exploring these ideas.
10 years old, that is a fascinating age to be exploring Stephen King novels. And, you know, I ask people all the time what it is about these types of books, whether we write these sorts of stories or we're just lovers of these sorts of stories. But horror writers are some of the nicest, kindest people that you could possibly meet. And I think it's hilarious that, you know, that they write these sorts of stories that creep us all out. And they're just sweet, gentle people for the most part. As a youngster, was it just the shock and taboo of it? Or was there something calling to you in these types of stories?
Yeah, I've always been someone who had a kind of calling to the taboo and the hidden, the things in the shadows. I've mostly explored that through crime fiction, but it was Stephen King and horror fiction, as well as some, you know, classic like H.P. Lovecraft, some more speculative fiction that got me initially interested in storytelling. I just found that as I became a professional writer in my 20s, that by then I wanted to base a lot more of the spookiness on the things that I knew existed in the world rather than the mysterious. So I do have a series, a Pandora English series, which is paranormal, where I explore some of that paranormal aspect. And again, that's aimed sort of at a more young adult audience. But most of my novels, most of my work, I'm known for these thrillers or historical crime fiction where I'm exploring, what we know about the darkest aspects of human nature, the sort of stuff that is historically grounded or grounded in research. And I think I've taken some of the lessons that I first learned as a 10-year-old in terms of storytelling and suspense and kind of making you think and sort of check over your shoulder, I've taken that and brought that into the world of noir and hard-boiled, and these different aspects are slightly more grounded in experiences.
There is something to be said about tackling these issues that are dark and scare us to our core, but tackling them from the comfort of our reading chair or, our bedside table, where we do our reading at night. There is something, and I love that you're tackling some of these topics and situations from the hard-boiled or noir mystery sort of genre. What do you feel like that the genres that you love and embody? What do you feel like that they open? What possibilities do they open for you, knowing that you are treading in those waters?
The crime genre broadly, but more specifically for me, the noir and hardboiled tradition, I think really gives us a wonderful opportunity to explore social justice issues of violence and society, issues of inequality, whether it's gender inequality, racial inequality, whether it's ableism or homophobia. All of this stuff plays into, the criminal justice system, criminality and murder, whether it's domestic or otherwise. I tend not to be sort of the domestic teacup mystery writer. My books have a lot more action, sometimes violent, sometimes less graphically so, but there's always an element of action. So whilst I absolutely love the amateur detectives that sit in their parlor and deduct so brilliantly, and I have enjoyed a lot of those novels over the years, my writing naturally tends towards something more action-based, where the qualities of the main characters are both cerebral but also physical. With Billie Walker, who's the central character of The War Widow, which is set in 1946, you have a woman who beautifully sort of marries, if you will, the traditionally masculine and feminine elements of people of that time. So she's got a touch of the Philip Marlowe's about her, in that she's really a great observer of society, and she is a private investigator. She doesn't mind going down those dark alleys, and she has a slight bit of cynicism. But on the other hand, she has the feminine qualities of the time as well, or what was thought of as traditionally feminine qualities. She's very stylish. She sews her own clothes, which she needed to do in the 1940s, and she wears her fighting red lipstick, which was a real lipstick from the brand Tussie at the time. And so she's this wonderful kind of mixture of qualities that give her authenticity to the 1940s and the resilient women of that time. Also make sure, she's still getting her hands dirty, and she's still getting her stockings torn, and which she gets very cross about because they were very expensive at the time. But it grounds her in the 1940s, but it also means that she's, pretty adept dealing with thugs in a back alley. And that's the type of scene and type of novel that I like to write.
Tara, I have to ask you, in reading your bio, I know that you have dual Canadian and Australian citizenship, and you have a fantastic and fascinating accent, where it sort of dips in and out of these interesting mixes. Tell me a little bit about your background, if you will, and I love how a sense of place sinks in and kind of soaks into our writing, whether it be the characters or the settings or what have you. But how do you feel like your personal background affects the way you write and the kinds of stories that you tell?
Excellent question. In The War Widow, I think that Sydney, Australia is sort of one of the characters. In fact, 99% of the locations described in the book are real, authentic locations that existed at the time and can be visited now, even if they're derelict and unsafe to walk through. They technically exist still today. So I have an aspiration to do a Billie Walker walking tour of Sydney one day. But in terms of my own personal background, I've dedicated this book to my Oma and Opa because I grew up on their stories of World War II. They were born in Holland, where my mother was born as well. And of course, when the Nazis occupied that region, they took a lot of people away. But for them, they took my Opa because he was considered an able-bodied man who could, contribute to the German war machine. So he was put into slave labor at a munitions factory in Berlin. And my Oma used to bravely cycle to visit him. She had 2 young children with him at the time, including my mom. And she would cycle across Holland to Berlin, smuggling flour and sugar in the hollows of her bicycle to give him these ingredients to bribe the foreman with bread, because he was a baker by trade. So he'd bake. Can you imagine baking bread in these munitions ovens in this Nazi munitions factory? And he used that to get a day pass and escape the Nazis. And as soon as they were able to, once they were reunited, as soon as they were able to, they wanted to immigrate, and they came to Canada. And as the story goes, the boat left one day for Canada and the next morning was leaving for Australia. And they were going to get on either, and the one just left before the other. So they ended up in Canada, and hence I was born here. So those types of stories of our ancestors and those who came before us are fascinating to me. And I wanted, I guess, to embody that resilience of ordinary people in the War Widow, the people who, weren't necessarily generals and at in the corridors of power when all of this was taking place, but people who were resilient in dealing with it in their own ways. And it means that I've got a hand in a kind of an international feeling of exactly where I belong. Canadian born, I've lived in Australia quite a bit. I set this book in Australia. Both places are home in a way, but then so is the US, so is Spain. I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit and to write about a lot of these places in my books.
I love it. I want to get back to idea of historical fiction and where the new book takes place. But for just a minute, in looking over your back catalog, tell me about the Pandora English series. Yeah. That in looking at your books, these really jump out. What was the idea behind these stories, and what were you trying to do here?
Well, with all of my books, they're really part of what is now a 21-year project of centering women and girls' stories and experiences in fiction and nonfiction. The War Widow is my 13th book. The Cobra Queen also came out this year. The Cobra Queen is my 4th Pandora English book. So it's part of a series that's, as I mentioned, paranormal. It's set in an alternate New York in a suburb called Spectre, which is on Manhattan Island and can't be found on maps. And it really it brings together, rather than being historical, it does bring together a lot of my research into ancient mythology and folklore and beliefs from those to do with the shadows and the taboo and those other elements that I guess I've always been fascinated by. And it's wrapped together really with this wonderful young female protagonist who is, everyone you'd want to be if she is the chosen one. She's very forthright and wonderful and surrounded by an eclectic cast of goodies and baddies and everything in between. But it's a wonderful way. The Cobra Queen's a wonderful way of exploring, particularly Egyptian, ancient mythology. And yes, you see, there's a lot of gods and goddesses in that series, particularly with emphasis on the goddesses, I have to say. The ones we don't hear as much about.
you just never know where those Stephen King influences will rear their heads, do you?
Indeed, indeed. And again, it's very research dedicated. I just any excuse to research is kind of where, I can't help myself. I go down the rabbit hole of research all the time. And with The War Widow, I'm using that very directly. I'm being very careful about like even the colors of the tiles on the floor of the building on that street at that time, really very specific details. I remember spending a couple of days trying to confirm whether Billie Walker could have a second telephone in her flat or apartment in Sydney at that time, because that was rare, or whether the towel racks could be heated. It's these little details, nothing. But I had to actually check, could she have a pink telephone? Were they even available at the time? That sort of thing that you might make assumptions about from watching Hollywood films. But I don't want to get my research from film and what's already been made before. I want to go right to the source. And with Pandora English, instead of Billie Walker, she's dealing in a world where I can make a lot more up, but I'm again bringing research to the fore by just exploring all of these past beliefs and in some cases current beliefs to do with the mystery and spirit world, to do with folklore and mythology.
Love it. I love the melding of past beliefs and bringing them into the modern era and letting seeing what'll happen. I love that so much. With your new book, The War Widow, that we've talked a lot over the last few years about historical fiction and this time period of World War II in specific. And there's been lots and lots of great books that have come out over the last few years dealing with the World War II era. And a lot of discussion about why it is we as a reading population are fascinated with these types of stories set in this time. And, there's a lot to be said about, the farther we get away from an historical event, the more we lose of that historical event, and the more of the individual characters that we lose, because there's just, the further you get away from something, the more it gets reduced to just bullet points, because we can't just go into all of the details about everything that ever happened. So it's just a natural thing to have. And I personally think that's one reason that we love fiction around this time, because we don't want to lose these stories. We don't want to lose the heroes and heroines that did such fascinating and, world-changing things. So first off, The War Widow takes place just after the war. Why did you choose to set this just after the war? And was there a particular sort of feeling that you were looking for this post-war? It's a different world after World War II. Was there a specific reason for setting this just after the war?
Yes, there was. I really wanted to focus on the long shadow of war, to focus on the fact that when war is finished, when victory is declared, it's actually not over. And that's, in fact, one of the lines from this book is that, the war may be over, but her battle continues. Her battle's just begun. And that was true for so many ordinary people. Their lives have been utterly changed. Their physical bodies may have been changed through injury. Their minds were changed. A lot of people had shell shock or PTSD, financially, and in terms of being able to access material goods, people's lives were completely changed. There was victory, and that meant one particular impending kind of a sense of destruction was relieved a little bit, but there was still this massive aftermath. And I believe that aftermath is intergenerational. It continues, generation after generation. There's still an impact. One of the storylines in this book has to do with a Jewish German family, and also has to do with what's commonly called Nazi loot or war loot. The items, material goods, and possessions that were taken from prisoners of war, particularly Jewish people during World War II, and others who were considered political opponents or political prisoners. That change of circumstances for those people, like many of them never got those things back. They lost a huge number of family members, but they also lost their homes, their sense of place, their ability to live where their ancestors had lived, their connection to their cultures. All of these things were altered in ways that couldn't be just fixed or just didn't disappear overnight. And I wanted to really, I guess, look at that and look at the impacts on ordinary people, everyday people, and look at the resilience of those people. It's dedicated to my Oma Opa, but it's not about, her journey on the bicycle with smuggled ingredients. It's about kind of what people like them did once the dust had settled and they were in a new country with a new outlook. For Billie, she's returned to Australia after working as a journalist and war reporter in Europe. And her sense of world has completely changed. Her place in it has changed. She's lost her father, who was a private investigator, and she reopens his investigation agency. But she's also lost her husband, who, she had a wartime wedding, and, he's missing, presumed dead. And her life is completely altered. And she's one of those resilient, women who survived that time by kind of, finding an inner strength and going forward into the unknown. And she has these extraordinary experiences as a result, which are all, unfold in the book. But yeah, I really wanted to set in the post-war period to look at the aftermath of war and how that impacts regular people.
Billie is what we might describe as a firecracker of a protagonist. Did Billie come to you fully formed, or did you discover her in layers?
She came to me fully formed. A lot of the other characters developed and changed, like Sam Baker, her assistant, or like her mother and lady's maid, Ella and Alma. She's just surrounded by these wonderful characters in The War Widow, but Billie Walker herself was quite fully formed by the time I put pen to page, or in my case, literally, fingertip to keypad. Sounds a bit less romantic, but yes. I heard her voice in my head, and anytime there's dialogue with her, it just flows. Some of the other characters started to come together quite quickly as well. So the banter between Billie and her mother, who's, she's a baroness who's lost most of her fortune, comes from Holland as well, like my family lineage. Although I have no baronesses in the family, I should mention. But she's a wonderful kind of examination of how people's fortunes changed and how they had to be very resilient and change completely the way that they were living their day-to-day lives. So the banter between Billie and her mother, Ella, is just wonderful. And I think the banter between Billie and Sam as the book progresses is wonderful as well. Sam's a disabled vet. He has an injury to his hand, and this is perhaps part of the reason why he's working as a second to a woman and a private investigator, because that was unusual for the time. But he makes a wonderful assistant or secretary, and they make an excellent team together. So I kind of, fell in love with all the characters as I went, but Billie was well and truly, formed and ready and raring to go and had a lot to say from page one.
The idea for this novel, did it come to you as a completed story, as it were, or did Billie just walk onto the scene and then things started happening? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I do, and I can visualize it. I can see her in her Oxford shoes and her shirtwaist dress walking on the scene, and that's exactly how it played out for me. I wish the story was fully formed. That might make me a faster writer. But I have to admit, after many years at this, that never seems to be the way it is. Even if I have an idea of the plot, it always changes and morphs during the process of writing, often significantly changes. So I tend to start with the characters and the sense of bringing characters, sometimes extreme characters, together and exploring what would happen if their lives intersected. And with Billie, it was just kind of like putting her in Sydney and letting her go. Like, where is this going to, how's this going to unfold? There are elements of the plot that I knew I wanted to include and explore, but actually how it unfolds was a process of discovery for me during the writing.
Of that. You mentioned earlier your love of research and getting to the primary sources. Could Billie have a pink telephone? Could she have more than one telephone in her flat? And things like that, that you obviously were researching during the writing of the book when you would come to something. But how much research goes into the pre-writing, or how immersed do you need to put yourself into the situation before you can actually start drafting?
I tend to throw myself in pretty deep, I'll be honest, Hank. I wear a lot of 1940s clothes. I sewed some of the outfits Billie wears. I had a material connection with her world and experiences. I collect 1940s kind of paraphernalia and documentation whenever I can find it. Often it's, very sadly collecting dust in the back of a charity shop somewhere, or a secondhand shop. And I'm one of those people who just has to adopt it and kind of like dust it off and give it a home somewhere. So yeah, I connect very much with the material of the time as well as the stories of the time, reading personal stories, particularly from women, because they tend to be less often written. In fact, if you read about women from the period, a lot of the books are self-published. And that's been very much the case until, say, the last 10 years. We've started to see that switch a little bit with more film and more books kind of coming out about the great women spies of the period and, heroines from World War II. The research for this book, the whole book took over 2 years for me to write, in part because of that research component. There was always something else, there was always something else to check or something else to discover as I went. Even aspects of Daking House, which is where Billie has her private investigation office for her business. It's a real place that exists that I was able to, go in and tour and speak to the owners of the business that's there at the moment. It's a YWCA, and I was able to go in, and there's like a corner room there we call the Billie Walker room, because it's where the real balcony exists, where she's always out there smoking one of her cigarettes and kind of contemplating a case. That balcony really exists in Sydney. So you can go downtown Sydney and look up and see, the Billie Walker balcony and the Billie Walker room. There's so much research that you can do. And I probably over-researched, to be honest. And I think it's a real challenge for historical, because if you're someone like me who's such a perfectionist with this, I still get stuff wrong all the time. It's not perfect, but I'm a perfectionist by nature. So I try. It means that I'll start writing a scene, and if I don't know something, it's like it can stump me and mean that I'm like, just don't worry about the color of the wallpaper right now. Just keep going. Characters, but I'll have these notes everywhere through the manuscript about, check this, check that, make sure that saying was around already in 1946 and it didn't come from the 70s or 80s or something. I need to check all this stuff to be satisfied, and that's time consuming.
I love that you immerse yourself in the things of the time, whether it be wardrobe or trinkets or things like that. I do a bit of that myself. I love having a physical touchstone, something that I can. Sometimes it may be an item that you can describe in your writing, and by holding it in your hand, you can come up with the best descriptions, that little details. But there's something ephemeral about holding an item from another time, and it's something that you can't quite put your finger on, but it's inspiration, if nothing else. And even if that item doesn't make its way into your manuscript, there's something grounding about it, isn't there?
Look, there is. And, if this was Pandora English, she'd probably say there was a psychic imprint of some
right
on the item. I'm not sure what I believe. I just leave that open. But there's definitely something there. There's something very special about having the responsibility of holding these items that have had significance to someone in the past, and just honoring them and giving them a place to be, and not forgetting about them, and not forgetting these histories. Going back to what you mentioned earlier, World War II had such a huge impact on the world, on so many people. And for most of us, our family histories have, stories from this time. And to honor that by remembering, by contemplating this time, I think does have value. And we can do that through a variety of different ways. Storytelling is a wonderful way, but even, honoring those objects instead of saying, oh, I'm just going to take it down to the junk shop or throw them out. They don't mean anything to me anymore. It's just kind of thinking about where they come from and what those people went through. There's a beautiful bracelet that I have, which was made of coins and an aviation badge, which was made by a pilot for his loved one. All handmade, and it's just made of these coins. And I have this, and I have no idea who. I know that it comes from the 1940s. I know it was a sort of common at the time for these guys to take what materials they had and put something together and mail it to their, fiancés or their loved ones and the people that they missed. But one of these has, come into my life and lost its connection with its original owner's, line of family. And I just think it's important to kind of honor that, recognize what it is and how much care was put into creating this object. It's a love trinket made of whatever materials that man in the field was able to get hold of. And it's just, I find it incredibly moving. I've got goosebumps just talking about it. Things like that, or the trinkets like lighters that are have inscriptions on them from concentration camps. Those types of items are just like, there's something very, very strong about them, very moving about them. And, if you do come across one, I think it's important to honor it and just sort of take a moment to recognize what it is and what went into the making of it in that, that experience.
And I hope that that books like The War Widow will be a sort of bridge for people to link us back to those times, and maybe to link us to some of these items that we personally don't get a chance to interact with, but we know that you have, and that loving care is translated to the book. The book, The War Widow, is available everywhere now in Kindle edition, audiobook edition, hardcover. We're going to put links to all those places in the show notes of this episode. Tara, this has been so much fun chatting. Where can people find you online if they want to dig into all the amazing stuff that you do?
Oh, thank you, Hank. Yes, please look me up and drop me a line. I'm at taramoss.com, that's my website. And I'm also on Instagram, Tara Moss Author, and on Twitter at Tara_Moss. I couldn't get Tara Moss, just this one word. Someone else gets a lot of my mail on Twitter, but yeah, you'll find me online, and I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book, or even if you want to share with me any of the family stories and histories that you have from this period. I would love to hear them.
Excellent. We'll put links to all those places in the show notes to make it easy for people to find you. Tara, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks. It's an honor, Hank. Take care.
A hitman with a conscience. Ian Bragg is paid to kill people. Only bad people, and not many, but for a great deal of money. Case the target. Make the hit. Move on. Until he meets the woman with sparkling green eyes who changes everything. A few pre-readers had this to say about Ian Bragg. Mark Dawson, million-selling thriller author, says a rip-roaring ride from start to breathless finish. Craig Martell hit a home run with The Operator. The taut, lean prose and lightning-fast pace make this a page-turner without sacrificing an ounce of story or depth. You'll find yourself rooting for the hitman main character as he faces the toughest decision of his career. The Operator is the start of a new thriller series I expect to see burning up bestseller list for years to come, says A.C. Fuller, author of The Crime Beat and Alex Vane media thrillers. Suave, romantic, and lethal, Ian Bragg is everything you want in a highly paid assassin. Can't wait to ride this train, says James Blatch, self-publishing formula. It's been a long time since I fell this hard in love with a book, a very long time. Author of Women of Wine County romantic suspense Terry Wells Brown says. Grab this book from Craig Martell, The Operator. Both Barrels Publishing is the brainchild of successful indie author James P. Sumner He has self-published over 15 titles in the last 5 years and has over 800,000 downloads so far in his career, meaning he has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with the indie publishing community. Knowing the struggles of the modern-day indie author as well as he does, he wanted to create a platform that would allow writers of any level to learn the ropes, navigate the pitfalls, and produce a professional novel without wasting time or money in the process. Both Barrels Publishing is the perfect one-stop shop for any indie author, combining James's expertise with his own team of editors and designers so you can help your novel realize its full potential and learn how to publish yourself. The purpose of Both Barrels Publishing is to help indie authors get their novels ready for publication without all the stress, hassle, and unnecessary expense. We want to make your lives easier, which is why we're giving you access to a top-notch team to publish your novels, along with a generous discount on their services. You can also work one-on-one with James to learn the intricacies of self-publishing. No hidden cost, no false promises. We simply want you to publish the best version of your novel. BothBarrelsPublishing.com.